I want to make more content that makes you think and question traditional narratives. Not every video is going to be about race, but that's what's on my mind right now, so you gotta bear with me. While I'm no longer talking to white people about race is a book by Renee Edo Lodge, in which she describes what it feels like to be a black person talking about race to white people in society. Despite a lot of evidence out there supporting the idea that white people do benefit from the way society is structured by the color of their skin, a lot of them shut down when you mention race. Not all white people, but you can't really tell who's going to be able to be receptive to the information before you go ahead and talk to them. So sometimes when you bring up the discussion, it feels like you're banging your head against a brick wall and you're making no progress at all, which oftentimes is why minorities don't talk about racial issues. They choose to be quiet. She realized after writing her blog post of the same name, she had a skill at breaking down these barriers that a lot of white people had. Because she had this ability to do so, she decided to upgrade her blog post to the book, despite writing the book not really being her responsibility in the first place. I bring that up because my last video I had an overwhelming amount of support, but of course, like all things you produce, the one negative comment did stick out to me and it made me feel like I was banging my head against a brick wall. I'll read it to you. It said, "More white people get killed by the police and more white people get killed by black people. More white people get killed by the police and more white people get killed by black people. And look at the facts once in a while." So they just ignored the whole video and left that comment because I countered both of those points. So then I responded, "There's also more white people in America. If you take into account the overall population, black people are 2.5 more likely to be killed by police than white people. Statistics mean nothing when you don't put them in their proper context." To which they responded, "I don't care, more whites get shot overall by blacks and police. The government isn't out to get you. White people lose their job if they say the N-word, but black people call us all kinds of stuff and get away with it. The racism exists in your head. Stop it and get some help." Which I spent a lot of time watching conservative media as a common point that's brought up by conservatives. They believe that it's easier for black people to change their thought processes than to attack unconscious or conscious bias that exists in the American political system. Some people argue that implicit or unconscious bias doesn't even exist. So I'm channeling my inner Renee and I'm going to, instead of give up, try again, but I'm going to try again at a different angle. All this in an effort to just show that racism doesn't exist just in my head. In fact, when you step away and look at the world clearly, you'll see that it doesn't exist in my head. It exists in your head. And one of the biggest points to bring up is that a lot of black issues are actually issues that are associated with class, but class and race are so deeply intertwined in American history that it's kind of hard to separate the two. Again, I don't have to do this, but it'd really be a shame if I kept all this knowledge and information to myself. So welcome to another YouTube video about some things that are in my head. I really just want to explain why I don't believe Juneteenth is enough and America needs to take a second step, and explain why, technically speaking, black people aren't free and haven't been free, and try my best to counter some of the biggest arguments that conservatives do bring up, that there is no unconscious bias or the society is not built against black people. So let's get started. People have been enslaved since the beginning of time. I guess specifically speaking, the beginning of human existence, because I'm pretty sure dinosaurs were smart enough not to enslave their own people, probably just eat them, which we don't need to do. So as long as people have been enslaved, there's been people that are trying to justify the enslavement of those people. Most civilizations and cultures ended up clinging to the principles that Plato and Aristotle taught about this subject. For those who don't know those teachings or the whole idea behind them, let's flash back to 399 BCE. It all technically started with Socrates, who is the father of the Socratic method, which you might be familiar with. I don't think enough people use it. It's the idea of just asking questions. Just continue to ask why. When's the last time you actually had a real thought? Most people just absorb information, and that's not thinking. Socrates was aware that a lot of people weren't thinking, which is why he thought democracy sucked, and he wanted people to just listen to one philosopher king, and that would push humanity as far as it possibly could go. He's also an interesting philosopher because he decided not to write anything down. Most of his teachings were actually preserved by the works of Plato and Aristotle, and now you have enough information to find this comic meme funny.
Go ahead and pause it if that's something you want to do.
And even though Plato and Aristotle had the same teacher, they had drastically different ways of seeing how the world works. This is where a lot of people actually think the left and the right started, Plato and Aristotle. To attempt to summarize both their teachings as quickly as I possibly can, Plato saw the world as ideal and tried to fit the world into those ideal principles, while Aristotle kind of observed the world and then tried to write his principles, understanding that sometimes things mess up, man. They both kind of use those teachings to try and justify slavery in a way. My bad, the enslavement of other people. I feel like I'm going to do that a couple of times, so if I mess up, please don't attack me. Plato justified the enslavement of other people by arguing that the Greeks were superior to all other regions, all other people, and other people were really just barbarians, or less than human beings. So he believed that those other people were not worthy of their free will or freedom, and he didn't think that they were smart enough to push humanity forward, so he believed that everyone else should just sit there and do the work that the Greeks said. While Aristotle believed that there are just people out there in the world that are incapable of the responsibility that comes with having free will, so you should just take it from them. Aristotle also had the idea of creating this hierarchy of souls in a sense. It was his way of organizing living organisms to kind of justify us eating, destroying, or being mean to those different organisms. He stated that plants just had a vegetative soul, which essentially just allows them to grow. He said that animals had a vegetative and sensitive soul that allowed them to not only grow but also feel. And then he said that humans had vegetative, sensitive, and rational souls, which allowed them to do all of the above but also think. His list also featured the idea that women were less human than men. I honestly kind of hate Aristotle. I don't know why we clung to most of his principles for so much, but he is one of the founding fathers of philosophy, so you take what you can get. And then he also justified the idea that if you're farther up the soul ladder, you can just destroy anything that's under the soul ladder. Most of civilization used one of those three principles to kind of justify the use of enslaved people. Because if you really think about it, if you saw another person as equal to you or on the same playing field as you, there's an emotion that'll probably get in the way. That emotion is guilt. Honestly, just think about if you saw another person as a human being, how much it would hurt on the inside for you. Human beings, as much as we've evolved, our emotions, our thought processes, haven't really evolved all that much. The only thing that really has changed is our perception and understanding of the world, which kind of changed how our emotions work. A lot of people, I'm not going to say all people because there are definitely some people that still believe in Aristotle and Plato's teachings of the world, see that their teachings are wrong and wouldn't be able to enslave another person without feeling the guilt. Unless you're a sociopath or still think that black people should be treated like cattle. You know, I was going to zoom past this, but I feel like it deserves a chapter that I should talk about by itself, mostly so you can see Plato's and Aristotle's teachings in action. So let's talk about the enslavement of black people. To quickly summarize, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but the American economy was actually garbage before they started to enslave people. And a lot of people look at the South and be like, that was the only place that there was a problem, but the North very much profited off the idea of enslaving people. The first thing that allowed the North to industrialize in the first place was the making of cotton textiles, which you can't make cotton textiles without the cotton that the South made. And then they also sold those cotton textiles back to the South to, you know, make clothing for the people that were being enslaved. Another way that the North profited off the enslavement of black people was through insurance. They allowed the enslavers to put insurance policies on their slaves. And in the policies, they weren't necessarily written as if it's like a life insurance policy. It was an insurance policy based off of property. And insurance companies actually made a healthy amount of profit based off of this idea. And it took Aetna Insurance Company until the year 2000 to actually, you know, acknowledge the fact that this was wrong. And they didn't give any reparations, which kind of seems like a trend with the idea of the enslavement of black people. How the South made money is a lot more clear in the economy. They produced 3/4 of the world's entire cotton. I'm going to repeat that for you. They produced 3/4 of the world's entire cotton. Think of how many people have made generational wealth off of the enslavement of black people, while black people couldn't even, you know, like read a book yet. Yet they were doing most of the heavy lifting and hard labor. And you know, white people like to call black people lazy. America was literally built on stolen land, which is a common idea, and stolen labor. Who would have figured? And both populations, you know, the people that they stole land from and the people that they stole labor from, have benefited nothing off the creation of America. But you know, I'm getting sidetracked, I'm sorry. But America needed the enslavement of people to continue in order for the economy to continue to flourish. Like I said earlier in the video, when you see another person as an equal, as a human being, it gets hard to do this. So for the people that were pro-slavery, they had to find a way to continue to dehumanize these people so you don't feel guilt, and it makes it easier to argue for the idea that they deserve to be enslaved. As much as this was for the white people, this was also for the black people. Because if you believe that you are less than a human being and that I'm doing you a favor for doing this whole slavery thing, it stops you from wanting to fight back, and it just allows you to be another cog in the machine without asking too many questions. So you whip them, you brand them as if they're cattle, you rape them so they can't control one aspect that makes them a human being. You only refer to them as the N-word so they don't even get the idea that they're a man, a boy, a child. Then remove their access to education so that you can just continue to say that they're stupid and that they're not as smart as the white man. You don't even allow them to have families, so the one aspect that would make someone feel human, you take away. And if they do have a family, you decide to sell them all away in different areas and different plantations. And they still do a lot of this process today. Don't turn a blind eye to how often they portray black people as if they're less than human on media, and how often they only take the time to show them on TV when they're being killed, ironically. A lot of people are robbed from their feeling of guilt or empathy or sympathy towards the black community. They don't even realize it. And I think this is an important time to talk about a pseudoscience study that a lot of people used and is still circulating today. In 1854, Josiah Note and George Gid were two very successful business people that one day decided that they were just going to become experts in the country of Egypt. You know, without going to school or anything, literally just transferred from business to experts in Egypt. They wrote an 800-page book called Types of Mankind. You can go ahead and Google it if you don't believe that exists. In which they stated in the book, Mongols, Indians, African Americans were all inferior to the Caucasian race. There was no science in this study, it was just personal accounts of how they dealt and interacted with these people of color. Those same personal accounts that conservatives now deny when talking about the idea of racism or white privilege, but that's neither here nor there. And they created this whole fake science around the idea of trying to prove that black people were inferior to white people, and forgive my language in this situation, called niggerology. And as crazy as this sounds, it all got credibility from Harvard University. And the craziest thing about this is it's still being circulated today, it's still making rounds, and there's a lot of people that still believe these teachings. There are medical professionals today that believe that black people do not feel pain the same way that white people do. To this day, I think it's just important that people decide to, you know, wake up, open their eyes, recognize where you learned what you learned, and recognize, is this true? There were also people that were arguing that the enslavement of black people were to the benefit of black people, and I will let John Green read a quote from John C. Calhoun. And he gave this quote directly on the Senate floor, so there's a lot of people that shared this opinion.
I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good.
And for extra verification that he wasn't the only person that felt this way, just a reminder that he was vice president. And I often hear people kind of bringing up this argument again, just slightly different, by saying that, oh, you should be happy that you're safe here in comparison to other countries. And I think it's important to note that we are grateful and see the privilege that exists of being here versus being, you know, somewhere else. Hence why everyone has not just picked up shop and just moved to another country. Juneteenth marks the day that slavery was abolished, but the mental gymnastics that white people had to go through to justify the use of slaves has never been addressed. A lot of the mental gymnastics that white people went through to justify the enslavement of black people has still made its way into policies. A lot of people still believe a lot of these teachings that went on during that time period. A lot of these ideas and principles are still held in the minds of white people, and some of them aren't even aware that they're not true. And no one has addressed the mental hardships that black people had to go through when slavery was abolished. They didn't even try and help them find their families. Again, go back to the last video I mentioned PTSS. This is where it stems from. They didn't even give them an instruction manual on how to survive in the American economy. They were kind of just like, here you go, you'll figure it out. Keep in mind, for capitalism to work, you need an absolute bottom as a way to incentivize climbing the ladder. You also need unemployment, because if everyone in the world's employed, that then shifts the power into the worker, because now I can demand more because you can't fire me. Who's gonna work my job? You get it? I personally think there's not a lot of research supporting this topic, so I'm going to give you a warning, a disclaimer warning, that this is my opinion. That they never addressed this because, one, if black people did find a way onto their feet, they would be afraid of revenge in some way, shape, or form. And I think this quote from Thomas Jefferson does an excellent job to explain it.
As it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other.
Two, that would mean that the mental gymnastics that they went through to prove that black people were less human than white people to justify slavery would be wrong, which would open the door not only to repercussions from the black community, but also the feeling of guilt within the white community. And the last and the biggest point, in my opinion, it would open the door for white people to now be at the absolute bottom, because now there is no differentiation between the society. I don't know if I explained that correctly, but as long as black people are treated worse than white people, poor white people can always say, well, at least I'm not black. And the second you kind of erase that level of equality, what are poor white people gonna say besides, wow, I'm at the bottom? So it's a way to preserve the status amongst the white people in America. So if white people and black people are actually equal, that would mean that the whole United States government would have to apologize for the idea of slavery. And also, an apology means nothing unless it's backed with something. And at this point, I think it's important to note that the government has yet to apologize for slavery. Well, technically speaking, they did apologize for slavery, but they apologized to the enslavers. They actually paid reparations the second slavery was abolished to the enslavers. They have yet to do anything to the people that were actually doing the labor or were unjustly treated during the enslavement. They tried in 2008 and they tried in 2009, but nothing has gone through since. Now, I say Juneteenth isn't enough, mostly because they have yet to apologize for the whole idea of slavery or make official amends. And also, when you just look at the definition of freedom, freedom is a state of not being imprisoned or enslaved. Although some black people are free, watch the Netflix documentary The 13th to see how they aren't really free from slavery. It has not gone away, it's just honestly has transformed. And in addition to that, there's this whole idea, which when you look into the philosophy of what it is to be a black person in America, which I'll link to a video by Sisyphus 55 in the description or up here, in which he describes that black people aren't really free because they can't necessarily be themselves. They are free to be white. For them to be successful in this economy, they have to do everything that white people do because this society was built to benefit white people, not black people, not Hispanic people. And if you can't see that, that's just you being ignorant. But that whole idea is a topic for later. I want to go back to proving why I think racial bias exists. Why racial bias exists in America's laws, and how the perception of a lot of black stereotypes stem from the failed addressment of the idea of the enslavement of black people. And you know, the lack of reparations, but let's keep talking. Race in its simplest form actually has nothing to do with biology. It's mostly a social construct, which when you mention that, you often get a lot of pushback because it seems like it's outwardly faced on my skin, but my race has nothing to do with who I am on the inside, and it has nothing to do with who you are on the inside. Race is completely about how society perceives you because of the way you look on the outside, which a lot of these teachings begin in school. You learn it from kindergarten to high school and all of the media that you consume without questioning anything. And one way that you can definitely go about teaching this whole concept to people is when you look in history and look at how Irish and Italians were discriminated against by the white community because of where they came from. They weren't always considered to be white. They made sure to separate you're Irish, you're Italian, because they thought that they were less than white Americans. Eventually this idea changed and they were then welcomed into the white community with open arms. So go ahead and try and tell an Irish or an Italian that they're not white now, and they might stab you. One of the first people to study this idea of race was actually W.E.B. Du Bois. When he took a trip to Europe, he realized that a lot of people in Europe treated him differently based off of his skin color than they did in America. Go figure. So he started to see race was something that was cultural as opposed to biological. Now I'm going to go on a quick tangent and talk about one key conservative thinker, Ben Shapiro. You might know Ben Shapiro from his hot takes. His biggest hot take in recent history is the idea that he didn't think rap was real music, which is just wrong. And he often ignores the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and a lot of other philosophical or sociological people that address the idea of race not being something that's biological. This is mostly because it goes directly against his agenda. So a lot of people that consume conservative media would have no idea that this even exists. Ben Shapiro wants conservatives to think that all black people or people of color have a victim mindset, and just routinely reminds conservatives of the idea that, hey, white people are suffering, white people are getting killed by the police, white people are poor too. And he wants you to think that America has done everything that they can to raise black people out of poverty, and they just can't do it. Even though if you know anything about history, one, the reason that they are in poverty is because America made it that way, and two, they just haven't even tried. This even gets poor white people on the conservative train because it seems like they're recognizing that they're struggling, but in actuality, they don't care about you. They just want to maintain the status quo and have people focus more on identity politics and ignore the idea that the wealth inequality in America is abysmal, regardless of what your race actually is. The bottom 50% in America has been on a downward spiral in the last 30 years, while the top 50% have been slowly increasing. Actually, slowly that's a light word. It's been rapidly increasing. And when he brings up a lot of the racial issues that have not been addressed at all, he often points to solutions that just would not solve the problem at all. But if you don't do your own research, it seems like it's a perfectly logical explanation or fix the problem. It's not. Why don't you read a book? So if you absorb that content, and trust me, I absorbed maybe 6 hours worth to write this video, you'd probably walk away if you didn't do any other reading, any other outside research, and it's the same way with the news stations that are conservative. You would walk away and be like, black people need to stop complaining. That would be your thought process. But if you looked at a single source from your own, you would see 26% of all white people are what is considered low income, which low income is pretty much you make twice the poverty line, which is barely low income, meaning that 73% of white people have no idea what it's like to be in poverty. 10% of that 26% have a better idea what poverty is because they're directly on that poverty line. And then 5% of that 10% are actually impoverished. They're below the poverty line. So when you look at that stat, you're like, oh, white people are kind of struggling. But then when you compare that to 57% of black communities make double the poverty line. 57. More than half of black people are low income. And then 29% of that 57% make the poverty line, so they're actually impoverished. And then 15.4% make below the poverty line. But you know, then again, it's completely against his agenda, so he would never bring something like that up. I'll include a video in the description that goes more in detail about the discussion of the race problem and the economy problem. And maybe I'll include a clip after this, depending on the length of this video. I just think it's so important that people, you know, stop just absorbing media from one specific outlet and actually, you know, listen to all sides of the situation and then form your own unique opinion. But that's kind of difficult considering it actually requires you to think. Back to W.E.B. Du Bois. Aside from founding the NAACP and talking about the idea of dual consciousness, which I really want to make a video about, so expect that in the future somewhere. He was hired by UPenn to write The Philadelphia Negro. This was written in 1899, fresh after the 13th Amendment in 1865. So it's a relatively recent study after slavery. So this is a great source to look at to see that, you know, what's going on with people. For some reason, no one mentions this piece of writing. A reminder, at this time, most white people believed that black people were inferior to the white people and that black people weren't even considered to be human. So when he started this study, he went door to door and just hung out with a lot of black people in the Philadelphia area. He actually talked to 9,675 African Americans within the Philadelphia area, asking them questions about their age, race, gender, literacy rates, all of that. And then he's comparing those. Then he compared what he found to the white community and saw if he could notice any differences. he found that blacks had lower literacy rates, poverty, higher rates of crime, higher portion of people in the service industry as opposed to trade or industrial work, higher mortality rates, higher rates of illness. After the study, he found and was able to conclude that a lot of the dysfunction within black communities came from not having access to the proper schooling and not having access to all of the lucrative jobs that the white people had access to. Again, keep in mind, for capitalism to work, you need a bottom, you need unemployment, and you need people to do those undesirable jobs. So who did look like was doing that right now? He found that the behaviors of black Americans was not due to racial inferiority, but indeed was a result of racial prejudice in America, which is the groundwork now for what a lot of people call racial formation theory. I'll let someone that's not me speak about this, mostly because it's one of those topics that I don't think I can re-explain without plagiarizing the source material.
Race doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't just imbue you with certain essential qualities. Instead, race matters because of the power that society gives it. For another example, let's stick with Philly and use the labor unions there in the 1890s. Because of prejudice against black workers and beliefs about their abilities and morals, trade labor unions didn't allow black workers to join. And because they couldn't join unions, many black workers couldn't get manufacturing or trade work, which paid much better than service work. And because they couldn't get these jobs, black communities had more men out of work, higher rates of poverty, and more criminal behavior, which then allowed the white workers and unions to justify their decision to not allow black workers into their union. The prevailing beliefs about race and racism ultimately reinforced themselves. This is what's now known as racial formation theory.
So as long as a picture exists of black people being the inferior race, it allows for the perpetuation of racial ideals. Now, if W.E.B. Du Bois found that problem in 1899, imagine if that problem continued to not be addressed since the start in 1899. Just think about how much it would spiral out of control if you never address the source. How do you think that would affect the progress of black people overall? Rewind to when I discussed the poverty rates. People are trapped, not by choice, but by design. Although a lot of the problems within the black community are issues that affect all people within the lower class, let's not forget why they got there in the first place, and let's not forget how you cannot discuss how intertwined this whole race and class issue actually is. And it all really comes from the idea of unaddressed racism. Racism runs so deep in America and so deep into the way that our capitalism has been made. They truthfully believe that black people aren't able to properly contribute to the capitalist society, which is why it's so hard for black people to climb out of poverty when compared to white people. If people truly believe that black people were able to contribute to society in the same way that white people were able to contribute to society, black people would have the same opportunities to advance up the ladder than white people. The reason that black people are trapped, you gotta think about this stuff. It's by design, it's not by choice. But let's talk about where America's choice has led us into society. W.E.B. Du Bois was a man that was kind of ahead of his time. He noticed that Americans were unwilling to address the legacy that slavery had left behind. Americans believed that equality had been achieved in the Reconstruction era. He also stated that the racial injustice that occurs in our society comes from an idea of memory suppression. If you never address how we got into this injustice in the first place, it's never gonna fix itself. If we can never talk about slavery in the past, if we can never talk about it now because it's, oh, it was so long ago, when's a good time to talk about it? And a reminder that they aren't sorry. They aren't sorry because they still carry the same beliefs and the same ideals and still hold the same culture. Du Bois argued if we never address the root of the issue, there's going to be an uprising. He also argued the biggest problem in the 20th century is going to be the color line. And it's still the biggest problem. All because they have yet to acknowledge slavery and the causes and the effects that it still has in the American capitalist society. And I think it's an important thing to also note, Karl Marx. Not Karl Marx, the communist, kind of, but Karl Marx, the philosopher. In addition to race conflict theory, you have conflict theory, or I like to word it as class conflict theory. That's when the working class sees that wealth is not being properly distributed from the top to the bottom. And when that unproportionately affects black people, in addition to them being discriminated upon through racial conflict theory, you get someone that's doubly as angry, which is why we are where we are today. So let's talk about my thoughts. Wow. You know, this issue, my opinion, all over the place. And I have so many opinions on this topic that I probably do need to make a second video, but I will definitely make a video about this in some way, shape, or form down the line. I think the most important things to note are, one, cancel culture. I changed my opinion on it. We need to be able to have conversation and a dialogue to make any progress, not only in America, but as people, because we need to be able to work together to solve a lot of the issues that we have as a society. And if we're not able to properly articulate our points, and if you can't have a standard conversation with someone where two opposing opinions come out as one opinion, we're not going to get anywhere as a society, and we're just going to keep butting heads and not making any progress. And I don't think the media companies, which drives into the next point, are helping at all. They're not providing information to have people make informed decisions. They're providing information to make people blindly follow whatever side you pick. It just makes you blindly follow that side, because you choose to continue to absorb that side's media. And I think it's really important that people are able to absorb both sides and make their own unique decision, because part of free will is the ability to, think for yourself. And a lot of people in America aren't thinking for themselves. They're just blindly following what they learned in school. They're just blindly following whatever is on the news. And most of the time that's Fox or CNN. So not very bright outlooks on the future. We live in an age where you can literally get any information you want in the matter of nanoseconds, but we're wasting it doing stupid stuff. Which drives another point that I want to make. I'm sorry I'm going all over the place. I didn't really write much of this stuff down. I'm kind of just free-flowing ideas here. I think America is purposely broken. It wants you to think that it's a hierarchy based off of class, but in actuality, it's a hierarchy based on race. The way that white people can be seen as being desirable over other populations is if they have access to all the wealth and the social status. And the way that they get that is making sure that a majority, and it literally is a majority of the black people in America are lower class. It makes the lower class almost synonymous with being black, which makes it hard to separate the black community from the lower class community. And when you make the lower class issue a race issue, you will never really be able to recruit the other race, because the other race will lose the ability to say, at least I'm not black. And as much as that seems like a easy thing for people to deal with, and a world where they think that people are equal, I spent a long time in this video articulating the point that there are a lot of people in this world that don't think black people and white people deserve the same rights. There's a lot of people in this world that don't think black people and white people are actually equal. So for them to be able to lose that part of their well-being or that part of their identity would suck to them. So it's purposely designed that way, because if the lower class was ever able to completely unite the bottom 50%, which were experiencing a big decline in standards of living, while the wealthier 50%, as they say, the poor gets poorer and the rich gets richer. If we were ever able to fully unite, we would be able to talk about and have that correct conversation, which is just how much power we give people like Jeff Bezos in our life. He can literally destroy most of the American businesses if he wanted to, because of how many businesses have to go through Amazon if they want to be successful. And he literally destroyed so many brick and mortar stores, and that was through just Amazon. How much power we give people like Mark Zuckerberg. He literally can control what you see on Facebook, which seems like it's not like a big deal, but with the idea of him skewing with what you actually see on the media, or what the algorithm shows you, because it wants to show you things that you agree with, so you stay on longer. And it's really contributing to this polarization between people that is making it harder for us to have these conversations, making it harder for us to be able to articulate our points correctly, making it harder for us to have conversations. And the fact that it kind of encourages people to not have to think. You just blindly follow your political opinion as opposed to thinking for yourself. And that's the actual conversation we should be having, is why are we giving rich people so much power in the American society? This is a bureaucracy, not a democracy. I have one vote, but if I have $1 billion, I have a lot more votes. It's not even like they try and hide it. And people are so focused on identity politics that they completely don't want to talk about the big elephant in the room, or they can't talk about the elephant in the room because they purposely have us focused on identity. You know, gay people are fighting for rights, which kind of distracts them from being able to, you know, try and attack the top 1%, which is exactly what they want. That's kind of how it's supposed to be designed, because the American economy needs those big businesses to continue to flourish. And like everyone knows, and I think COVID has made this clear, America cares more about profit than it does about people. And I think this video has been long enough. So I'm Will Walks. Will Walks is out.